Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another First Friday event. I hope you are all well and not suffering from either COVID-19 or too much smoke. It's certainly an interesting world that we currently live in. Before I start in our introduction, I wanted to really open it up with a quote this evening. And normally I would do that a little later, and this is from Thyla Tharp. And she says that art is the only way to run away without leaving home. So I hope that you find these First Friday events an opportunity for you to run away, because so many of us are confined to our homes or our apartments or to very small spaces. So I hope you enjoyed this evening's presentation. Now, this evening we are so lucky because we have Rinat with us. She's a local artist. She grew up in Israel and immigrated to the Bay Area as a young adult. She lives with her husband in Woodside and has 3 adult daughters. Rinat's work is inspired by thinking people around her. She is fascinated by the process of thinking, how we grasp concepts, how we connect the dots, how we make choices to better ourselves and therefore bettering the world. Her work is mostly abstract with some figures occasionally. She is using a medium called Encaustic. Today's talk will focus on the encaustic medium, its history, and how Rinat is using it in her own practice. So sit back, relax, have the opportunity to run away without leaving your home and enjoy the fascinating art that Rinat will present to us this evening. Thank you and enjoy.
Hi there. Okay, hope you can hear me. Thank you, Tom, for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for showing up and showing interest in art and in the encaustic medium. My name is Rinat, as Tom said, and I live in Woodside. I have a home studio here, and the medium that I'm using is encaustic, and this is the topic for today speak. So I'm going to share my screen with you. If you can bear with me for a second. I have those slides to show you. Okay. So here's my home studio. I'm starting here. It's a little old photo, and my studio is not as clean right now as it is in this photo. And I want to talk, as I said, about encaustic. So what is encaustic? Encaustic is a medium that is made of mostly wax. And you can see in the photo, this is the wax that I'm using. Typically it's beeswax, but there are other types of wax, like some plants wax, such as soy, petroleum products, such as paraffin, and some other types of wax. I think most artists today use beeswax. It is mixed with the resin, which makes it a little harder, a little more heat tolerant. So it raises the melting point. And it makes it a little harder. A lot of artists mix their own wax. It's a little messy, it's a little time consuming. I got a little spoiled and I cherish my time in the studio. So I buy them this way. They come in nice cubes. I'm holding one here. It's already mixed with resin and it's nice and clear. It's a little bleached too, so it's not so yellow. And this is what I'm using. If you're going around of course not right now, to galleries and museums, you're bound to see a lot of encaustic. You may not know it. And so people think that the encaustic medium is something new and popular and very contemporary, but in fact, the encaustic medium is an ancient medium. So we are talking today a little bit about the history of encaustic art. It has a very long history in terms of time, but it's actually pretty short because it kind of disappeared for a long time and then it came back recently. I'm going to go over a little bit of some local encaustic artists. It's kind of nice to know what's around us. And I'm going to show you some photos from my own studio and my own process and practices. So the first evidence for encaustic art is from ancient Greece. And this is actually not it. This is an evidence for it. We know that the ancient Greeks built their boats and waxed them they used wax chalking in a way to waterproof them. And the assumption is that someone, one of those shipbuilders got creative and added some pigments to the wax and started to paint on these boats. And we have some evidence from pretty trustworthy historians. One of them is Homer. Homer, of course, is a poet, Greek poet. And he mentioned those painted boats sailing into Troy. And the other historian is a Roman historian. So for him, Greek is ancient already. It's history for him. And he also speaks about the encaustic boats and also how some artists took the encaustic off the boats into their easels and how they make sculptures and other types of encaustic art. We're not sure why they cover their sculpture with wax. Here's another evidence. Again, it's not a direct artifact. We don't have any of those boats and we don't have any of those sculptures, but here's an evidence. This is a vessel for water or for oil. And you see it depicts an artist applying wax onto sculpture. Not sure why they added the wax to it, but I'm assuming to add color and maybe also to waterproof those sculptures. That if they are made of terracotta, you know, it was not very resistant to water. So that's what we have so far, and not very exciting, but right now the excitement starts. So I am talking, of course, about the very famous Fayum portraits. This is a huge series of portraits, and we are talking about Greco-Roman Egypt. What does that mean? It means Greek people who moved to Egypt during Alexander the Great, after he conquered Egypt. So they're living in Egypt for generations, and it's under the Roman time. So around 100 BC to 200 AD. And think about those Greek people, kind of like maybe you know, people from Mexico living in California under the US government. So these Greek people retain some of their own culture. For example, their Greek painting is very typical Greek. And some of them also adopt the local habits. For example, they mummy their dead. Even though the Romans actually prohibited that, they continue that. And in that case, they also painted those portraits. So first of all, let me show you some of them. They're really, really special. I think one of the things that gets me excited when I see those portraits is that they're so individualized. If you know these people, you'll probably recognize them from the portraits. They're very Greek style. You can see the Greek haircuts, the facial expressions. This one is a full mummy. You can see, well, not the mummy, but the case, the mummy case, and how the portraits is mounted on it. You can see the fashion, you can see the hairstyle. And another thing that's good to note, oh, you can see that this one is not one of those portraits, so I'm gonna go back. One thing to note is that they only use 4 colors. They use black and white and red and brown. And all the rest is mixtures of that. And you can see it's really, really realistic, the way they look at you. Now there are almost 1,000 of those found, and they were found way after they were painted, between 800 years and 1,000 years after they are painted in the from the 16th century to the 17th century through the 19th century. They were found in Egypt and became, on one hand, very valuable, and on the other hand, those people who dug them out didn't always respect them. They didn't know to archive them very well. I read something about some of them were cold at night and they burned some of them to get some heat. So that's pretty sad. But imagine going into underground cave or a chamber and finding hundreds and hundreds of those portraits. So I'm gonna go back. So after the Roman culture kind of deteriorated, the encaustic medium pretty much disappeared. One reason for that is that other paints were developed. So I think the main competitor to the encaustic was tempera colors. They were based on egg yolks and pigments, and they were not as rich and not as beautiful as the encaustic medium, but they were much easier to use. Of course, you didn't need to heat, you don't need to melt the wax. It's much easier when you have paint available. So the encaustic medium pretty much disappears from that era till the 20th century with few exceptions. And this is one of the exceptions. This is from the 7th century. It was done in Constantinople, which is of course Istanbul today in Turkey. That was where the center of the Eastern Catholic Church was. So we're talking about beginning of medieval times. You can see the style is not Greek or Roman at all. It's very different. This is a small icon. It's about 14 by 18. And today it's in Moscow in one of their museums. But it was in Istanbul or Constantinople. You can see again the style and the preservation of the whole thing is not as good as the portraits of Fayum. Another exception before the 20th century is some wall murals that happen in churches, mostly in Northern Europe and also North America. Not sure exactly why they use encaustic for these. I think it was much later during the 17 and 1800s, and they were very enchanted with ancient practices and ancient art. And also maybe for waterproofing those walls, because again, we're talking about very northern countries. This specific church is actually in Boston. The painter of these murals is an American called, I have to get my notes here, I think he's John Lafarge, and he's an American painter. I think painters in Europe and America who were studying art were really familiar with ancient practices, as I said, At that time, they found the burned city of Pompeii, which was caused Europe to really go crazy with ancient Greek art and Roman art. And of course, during that time, all sort of artifacts came from all the different colonies, including China and of course, Egypt. So they were familiar with the encaustic. I want to talk a little bit about how they apply the encaustic, because it's very similar to what we do today. They use wax and they heated the wax on some hot coals, probably not open fire, because it would burn the wax and it will, the pigment will disappear or burn. So it was pretty complicated back then, right? Today we just plug a heater into the electricity. And they used a palette knife, probably heated, to fuse the wax together. So one of the things that I failed to mention at the beginning is that the word encaustic is Latin for to fuse or to burn. And the reason is when you apply the hot wax onto your painting, you usually apply it in layers, and you need to use some kind of heat source to fuse the layers together. So you get a nice cohesive piece of work, and the layers don't peel off each other. So back then they used probably hot coals, then they used some hot palette knife to fuse the layers of the wax together. So these are the two exceptions that I found. I'm sure there are some more exceptions, but for the most part, the encaustic practice pretty much disappeared. In the 1400s, oil paints were developed. And of course, oil paint took over the art world completely till today. Oil paint is probably the most popular paint medium. They are very vibrant, they're very rich, they are beautiful. There's a lot of variety of colors. They're very strong. They can withstand time, and it pretty much took over tempera and all the other mediums that are available. In the 20th century, encaustic came back, and of course, the first one to use this is Diego Rivera. Diego Rivera, I'm sure you heard his name. He's a Mexican muralist and painter. He was born at the end of the 19th century, and he passed away in 1957. And he was very involved in politics. This is a wall mural that he did. He did several murals, but this is the first one that he did using encaustic. Again, I'm not sure why he chose encaustic, but he was very informed, and he, of course, knew about the encaustic medium. Maybe there was some kind of issue with waterproofing the walls. You can see his political views here. He was very involved in the Communist Party in Mexico. You can see the hammer and sickle here on red flag. You can see the laborers. You can also see the figure of his wife, Frida Kahlo. I'm sure you recognized her. She usually did not wear labor wears. She usually had those beautiful Tijuana's dresses with a lot of flowers and a lot of embroidery. But she appears, her face appears in many of his paintings. The interesting thing about those murals is pretty much that's the first time we have governments paying for public art. He got commissioned by the government. Before that, it was more royalties, queens and kings paying for art, and of course churches. And it was not so much for public view unless you went to the church or unless you lived in those palaces. Of course now there's much more awareness for public art, and there's much more investment in that. Here's another painting by him. It's another encaustic, but this one is not a mural. This is on canvas, which is interesting because today we usually don't paint with encaustic on canvas because things crack on the canvas. It's not very stable. So I'm not sure how he did that. Possibly he glued the canvas onto some kind of rigid platform. I'm not sure. But this is again another very famous, you can see again the theme of laborers. This is a baker. And again, the medium here is encaustic. So he was the first one to use, first one we know, to use encaustic medium in the 20th century. This is more than 2,000 years after the Greeks in Egypt painted their Fayum portrait, so it's a long gap. And even though he was the first one, the artist that really brought back the resurgence of encaustic is, of course, Jasper Johnson. Jasper Jones. Very famous American artist. He loved to paint the flag. There's a lot of flag paintings that he did. He loved symbols in general. He painted flags, he painted maps, he painted targets, and he used the encaustic a lot. I want to quote him here. He said in a much later interview in the 80s, he said, "I went out and I bought some wax and started working. It was just right for me. Everything I did became clear." And I really relate to that because in my practice too, I didn't know about encaustic, and when I discovered encaustic, it was like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I need. And I'll tell you a little bit about that later. Let me show you a detail of this flag where you can really see the wax. You can see the dripping, you can see the brush strokes. They're kind of coarse and very, there's a lot of texture. And you can also see how he really liked to embed pieces of papers between layers of wax, tickets, newspapers, all sort of familiar print material. I do that a lot too. I really love to include papers in my collages. Here's another Jasper Jones painting. It's called Green Target, and you can see again the texture of it. Again, he likes to paint symbols that we all know. I think he called it something like objects that our mind knows. Like we don't have to have too many clues. We look at it and we know exactly what it is. Here is a detail. Again, you can see the brush strokes, the thickness of it, and the paper that he puts inside the layers. Here's another flag. This is white flag. Again, the same idea that even though it's not the right flag, it doesn't have the right colors, we know exactly what it is, of course. And I have a little flag story of my own. I always wanted to paint the flag, and for some reason I felt like I didn't earn it yet. I don't know why. Now that you think about it, it sounds really silly, but I felt like, oh, you know, only renowned artists can paint the flag. I cannot. But I had an opportunity. I'm volunteering for an organization called Kids in Art. This is an organization here in the Bay Area that pairs artists with kids that have cancer, and we do art together. And I was working with this boy, and here's our work, for a show. And this show had to feature the kids' art next to the artist art that is matching the kids' art. And he wanted to paint the flag, and I was really excited. So the one on the right is his flag. You can see that he wanted it very colorful, and what I did, I just cut the paper for him and he pasted it all, and he wrote some words on it. I don't know if you can see the words. It says love and community and people and friendship and care. This is a boy that survived very, very difficult cancer. He barely made it. So he appreciates love and life. And the piece on the left is mine. I wanted to match his, and I added people to the flag with some connection between them. I remember debating whether to put the blue part with the stars on the right, which is the wrong side, but I wanted to mimic him and support him, so I did that anyway. And it was a very successful pair of paintings for this show. So back to our history. We are done with Jasper Johnson. Oh, there is a photo of both of us here next to our paintings. He's much older now. This was probably 6 years ago, something like that. The next artist who is very famous for her encaustic practice is Linda Benglis. She was born in 1941, and as far as I know, she's still alive. She did those maybe paintings, maybe three-dimensional sculptures, very, very thick wax with a lot of dripping. I'm going to show you a detail of that. Here's a detail. You can see the dripping. You can see the layers of wax here. And the reason I want to share this one with you is when everything opens, not right now, the Anderson collection in Stanford has one of Linda Benglis' pieces. It's actually very similar to this one. It's a little bigger. So go and look for it. It's kind of exciting to see one of her wax pieces in this collection. By the way, speaking about Stanford, the Art Museum, the Culture Center has two of the Fayum portraits too. They're usually not on show there. They are archived very carefully. Of course, they really want to protect them. But I hope at some point they'll show them. The Fayum portraits, by the way, are all over the world. They are in many museums all over the world, in Egypt, of course, but also in Europe. The Metropolitan Museum has several. They're beautiful. It's really worth going to see them. And again, hopefully we can see them locally at the Culture Center one day. The next artist, encaustic artist, is a local Bay Area artist. His name is Howard Hirsch. He's in San Francisco. And the interesting thing about him is that he's not using brushes to apply his wax, but he's actually pouring the hot wax into patterns. And it creates these really beautiful patterns. He uses beautiful colors. Here's another piece by him. I am familiar with his art very much. He's my neighbor at the Hunters Point Open Studios. I always get a studio in there, and he's my neighbor there. But I've never seen him pouring his wax. He was kind of secretive about it, and he didn't want to share that technique. But in his studio, you can see this is his studio. There were two sawhorses. That's his pouring station, where he poured the wax onto the panels. And he actually got rid of these two sawhorses probably 2 years ago, and actually sold them as an art piece to one to a museum and one to a gallery. So now his studio is nice and clean. He doesn't have those, wax dripping everywhere. And he moved on to another type of art. You can see the art behind there, the black and white, three-dimensional art. That's what he's doing now. He's an amazing artist. He's doing beautiful things. So that's Howard Hirsch. Another local artist that I really admire is Lisa Kairos. And you can see how she uses the transparency of the wax to see through the layers. You can see that it's very layered. There's a lot of depth to her work. She's extremely accurate and patient with her work. All this lacy kind of work is really, really impressive. And I owe a lot to Lisa. She actually was the one who introduced me to the encaustic medium. At the time, I painted with acrylic paints and I did mostly collages. And I was really frustrated and struggling with not being able to layer things. I wanted to be able to show into the depth of my collage. And I couldn't with acrylics. And she invited me to her studio and she showed me around, and it took me about maybe 5 minutes to decide that this is it. I'm buying all the equipment and all the new medium, and I'm starting with encaustic, and I'm very thankful to her, and I love this medium. So this is Lisa Kairos, beautiful art that she's producing. So here we are in my studio. It's where I'm sitting now. This is a little older photo. You can see in the front of the photo, you can see my paints. I have one here in my hand. It comes in little cubes. They're already mixed, the wax with the resin with pigment, and you can buy them anywhere today in art stores. I'm also mixing my own paints. I think I had one here next to me before here. These are paints that I'm mixing. I'll show you some photos of that. And then behind the paints, there is the hot palette. So of course, if I'm using wax, I need to melt it. It needs to be hot when I apply it to my wood panel. I'm working on wood panels. I keep my brushes warm too on this palette, hot palette, because if you lift these brushes off, of course, they become sticks. They're not brushes anymore. The wax hardens and you can't use the brushes anymore. So I keep them hot on the hot palette. And then behind it, of course, is my halfway painting after already several layers of paints and several more to come. Here's a close-up of my paints. So it's a solid in room temperature and even hotter room. It's going to be a solid. A lot of people are very concerned when they see my art. They ask, what if we have a very hot home? What if it's a hot summer? What will happen? And when I work with melted wax, it's over 200 degrees. So hopefully we're not going to get there. It's not going to get that hot. So even on a very, very hot days, nothing is going to melt unless, you put my paintings by mistake on a very, very hot spot. I just had a client a couple of years ago who bought a piece from me, moved an apartment, and leaned the piece of art he bought from me against the heater. And he came back home and it was all a puddle on his carpet, and it was really heartbreaking. But we did a new one for him and all is okay. It's just art. I kept telling him, if we're healthy, everything is fine. Here's the hot palette. It's not hot actually in the photo, and the reason I know it is because in the pen, the white wax would be clear if it would be hot. So it's not hot right now. I'm just taking a photo. There's actually a really funny story about this photo. I am sending newsletters to, a list of emails that I have, people who like my art and people who follow me. And I just tell them every month, about my progress and what I've been doing recently. It's probably every other month, not really every month. And I sent this photo in my newsletter, and somebody called me and said, I want to buy this piece. And I answered him and I said, well, first of all, you can't really see the whole piece. And second, it's not even finished. And he said, I know, I just like it. And he bought it when it was finished. It was funny how sometimes it's so hard to sell art, but there we go. This is the torch. So I told you that we need some heat source to fuse the layers of wax. Some artists use heat guns. Some artists use hair dryers. I've seen artists using irons. I used to open flame, but once I used it, and I'm sure you guys or some of you are familiar with this kind of torch. It's used for cooking, for baking rather. It's much easier to control. You probably understand that it's a little tricky because you want to melt the wax so that it's fused with the previous layer, but you don't want to create a puddle of your painting. So there is a fine balance, and it just takes practice. But you know, things sometimes happen that you don't want to happen. Here's a panel, just a few layers into the painting. So it's just clear wax, a few layers of it. I usually want to start by applying a few layers of wax for two reasons. One is that I want the actual wax paint to adhere really well, to stick really well to the panel. And the second one is if I want to groove and excavate some of the wax, I need some layers of wax underneath. So you will see what I mean in a second. This is the same panel, few more layers afterwards. Of course, I'm not taking a photo every layer. There will be a lot of photos. So this is several layers of paint. And then if I want to create more fine lines, you can see how I use this sharp tool. It's actually a clay tool to groove the wax, and I'm excavating it. And then I fill it with either oil paints in this case. And so all these little grooves are filled with oil paint, and you can see my hand cleaning the extra oil paint. Another option is to fill it with wax in different color. And actually, I rarely do oil paints anymore because, as you probably know, oil paints take time to dry. You need to let it sit for about 2 weeks. And I don't have that patience. I want to keep going. And I'm sure in some of my paintings where I have oil paints between layer of wax, I'm sure it's still wet in them. So I'm using more wax now than oil paint. This is a little more addition onto the same panel. And here is the finished painting. This is several years ago. I'm using, as I mentioned before, I use a lot of paper cuttings. I love magazine paper with its beautiful colors, and I love newspapers with the simple grayish, yellowish colors. So I use that a lot. I have a very sharp, small, precise scissors that I'm using. And here, the same paper cutting is already in between layers of wax. And I just want you to remember, do you see this line, the dotted line, all the lines that are dotted? I just want you to remember that because I'm going to show you later how I'm making those lines. In this one, you can see the little pieces of paper embedded between layers, and the top layer is what people call stitched line. This is not my name, but people always ask me, how do you stitch wax? And of course, it's not really stitching. It's just very small brush strokes that create this dashed line that looks a little bit like stitched. And this is the full painting. It was actually sold today. This painting was sold today. It's kind of exciting. You can see that it's very layered. It has a lot of small, very tiny pieces of paper in it. In this painting, there is some paper cuttings that are figures. I like to do that too. So I draw figures on the paper, I cut it, and then I put those in different layers. So they're in different depth inside the painting. This is another piece with a lot of paper cuttings. All these small lines are paper cuttings. And you can also see, if you look carefully in the middle, you can see this stitched line on the top. That's the top layer. Here's another piece. There's no paper here, but you can see that there's a lot of layers. So you can actually, even though the painting is very, very flat, it looks like it's actually much deeper just because of the translucency of the wax. And that's why I love the wax so much. Oh, that's the piece that I showed you before. It's hanging here in the Peninsula Art Museum in Burlingame. I hope you're familiar with this museum. It's a real gem. It's a beautiful museum. They keep changing their exhibits. And unfortunately, they had to close their doors recently. They're looking for a different space. They had to move out of that space in Burlingame. I hope they're finding space. I heard something about finding space in San Mateo in the Hillsdale Shopping Center. I'm not sure it's true, but when everything open, check it out, Peninsula Art Museum. It's really nice to have more art museums in the peninsula. This is my collection of papers. I love the colors that magazine papers offers. And when I read magazines, I usually rip off colors that I like and I store them by colors, and it's nice and accessible. Here are some more paper cuttings. Again, I do it so much that it becomes accurate, and I have the nice, easy tool to cut. So it's easy to make those really delicate cuttings. Here's another one, and it's going to go on that panel that you see in the background. And here is the finished piece. You can see that there is a lot of paper cutting. Those circles are all paper cuttings, and you can see how they're in different depth. Some of them are deeper, some of them are more shallower. This piece, by the way, is donated to Kids in Art, that organization that I mentioned before. So it's not sold yet. So if it's sold, 100% of this piece is going to go to Kids in Art. Check that organization out. It's a great, beautiful organization, a great cause. Here I'm holding, it's a little hard to see, I'm holding a wooden spoon, and what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to flatten the pieces of paper into the wax without hurting the paper. So the reason why it looks so blurry, it's because I have a piece of paper, vellum paper, between the paper cuttings and the wooden spoon. So I'm just kind of going back and forth. I'm trying to make sure there's no air bubbles under the paper. And I'm trying to make sure that the edges of the paper cuttings are not sticking out, because the next thing I'm going to do is use my torch, right, to fuse everything. And if things stick out, they'll be in flames, which happened once or twice or more. This is my best friend, the scraper. I always scrape my layers to make them as thin as possible. And the reason for that is so that when I heat the layers, when I fuse them, I get rid of all the valleys and the hills, which make the wax melt unevenly. So everything that I do, pretty much, I always scrape and get rid of the those extra hills to make it as flat as possible. Some artists like the textural effect of wax, but I'm always trying to create very smooth finish. So I always scrape. This is another example of how I make really fine lines. So I groove those circles and fill them with wax color this time, not with oil paint. And after I scrape it, I get a really nice fine circle, in this case, fine lines. Oh, here is how I collect all my scrapes and all the drippings. I don't throw anything pretty much away. Everything that's left over on my palette, I collect them into those silicone molds. You know, these are cupcake molds. And then I mix the color to create my own colors. So here, this is how it looks like. You can see the cupcake shapes in colors that I mixed. And these are some of the tools that I'm using to cut through the wax, to excavate it or to groove it, to poke it. Remember the lines that I asked you to remember, this dotted line in the yellow piece? The tool that I'm using for that is the tool in the middle, the blue one. And if you are sewing, you know this is a sewing tool. It's used to mark patterns on fabric. And I use it to poke the wax. So if I run this wheel over the wax, it pokes little holes in the wax. And then I fill it with either oil paint or a different color wax and clean it up. And I get these dotted lines that you saw in that yellow piece that was hanging in the Peninsula Art Museum. I think I'm pretty done here, and you're welcome to ask questions if you're interested. I have my website here, my Facebook and Instagram addresses, and of course you're welcome to get on my mailing list just to see what's happening in the studio. Don't worry, I'm not sending a lot of emails, probably every other month. And it's kind of fun just to connect with people who enjoy my art. Thank you.
Thank you, Rinat, for a wonderful exploration in this very unique and very ancient art form. We have a couple of questions, and one of them is, it's such a wonderful engineering view of art. People were wondering, how do you fill in the little wax guidelines?
Oops, I'm sorry, Tom, I didn't hear some of the question. I didn't hear the beginning of the question.
No, it's all right. So people have commented that it's a wonderful engineering view of art. How do you fill in the little grid lines, excuse me?
Oh, those grid lines that I filled with oil paint?
Yes.
So I fill it with a small, either a small brush or even just a napkin. I just kind of push the oil paint into those grooves until they're completely filled. And of course, by then the whole panel is smeared with oil paint, and then I need to clean it. And I clean it with vegetable oil that picks up the oil paint real easily, and it's not toxic or anything. So it's very easy to do. As I said, I don't do that as much anymore because I don't have patience to wait for it to dry.
So how long on average would you say that it takes you to finish a painting? Because you can see that this is a lot of effort in order to create this.
Yeah, it takes, it depends, of course, on the size, but for my bigger pieces, I would say it's about a week of work.
Amazing. Only a week. I was envisioning a much longer period of time. Now, I noticed through your work that you don't do many figures that are more detailed. Is there a reason? Is that not something that you're interested in? Like, you know, in the beginning, you were showing portraits of people and the three-dimensional aspect of that, and yet not for you.
That's correct. I am more of an abstract artist. I love to convey more abstract ideas in abstract painting, where you know, you convey ideas that you can't really paint with objective art or with portraits or with scenery. And so when I do figures, many times they're also a little bit abstract or symbols really of people and individuals and the connections between them, but usually it's not about that specific individual. So it's more abstract.
So many artists, when they're out and about, they'll have their sketch pads and they can begin something that inspires them. For you, how does that work for you? If you're out and inspired by something, you can't really bring out, a little wax pad and start working. So how does that work for you?
So usually my inspiration is, again, more abstract. I can be inspired by a certain color that I see or a certain pattern that I see, but not objective reality. And even so, I still sketch many times the idea that I have for an abstract painting. So I sketch it. It's not always guaranteed to end up like my sketch, but at least I have some kind of plan. And it has a subject and it has some kind of message per se, but it's not an objective art. It's abstract.
So your work is definitely beautiful. When you start a painting, do you have a finished image in mind, or does it create itself as you go?
It's a combination. I usually have some kind of idea, and it sometimes ends up differently because I didn't succeed, and sometimes it ends up different because it just took me somewhere else, and I changed my mind or changed my decisions. But I do have a vision of what I'd like to see.
Great. So you covered a little bit about, and you told a sad story about one of the paintings that got put to the heater. But in general, the environmental conditions, one could not expect to have the painting melt, correct?
Correct. Yeah. Generally, the heat inside homes is not enough to melt them. I'm actually more concerned about cold. If I ship something to the East Coast, I definitely check the weather if it's the winter, because the cold, extreme cold, can crack the wax. And it actually happened to me. I sent something to DC, to a small gallery there. And I think they let it sit for a very, very short time outside the gallery, and it cracked. So cold actually concerns, to me, it is more of a concern. But normal heat in homes is not enough to melt them. I would say I would never put them in the attic. If people buy my art in a show or in an open studio, I always tell them, don't go out to lunch and leave it in the car. It will be very hot and that will melt it. But inside your home, it's safe.
Fantastic. So how did you come to this particular form of art? What was your real inspiration? Because it's a difficult medium to work in.
Yeah, as I said, it really, really fulfilled, something that I struggled to do before. I really wanted to layer my art, and the wax just allows it because it's translucent. Now you could use the wax as very opaque. If you are using it, for example, this can be very opaque color if I just use it as is. But if I add more clear medium to it, it's translucent, and I can see almost everything through the layers to the bottom of the piece. So that's why I chose wax. And yes, it has challenges. It's harder to transport. You have to be careful that it doesn't crack, it doesn't melt. But to me, it's worth it. I just love the effect of the wax.
Well, we love the effect that you're able to create with the wax. So your work is definitely fantastic. Um, Many people were commenting throughout your presentation just how fascinated they were by it. So on behalf of the Woodside Arts and Culture Committee, I want to thank you for taking this time away from your work to not only give us the history of this process of this particular form of art, but also what inspires you and how you're able to create your wonderful art. So thank you so much for joining us this evening and giving us this opportunity to explore a very unique and rare medium that many people are not familiar with.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very happy to. As you can see, I love to talk about my art, and I really appreciate you inviting me.
Well, thank you. I want to remind everyone that, again, these are sponsored by the Woodside Arts and Culture Committee. We have the first Friday of every month. So next month, we'll have another exciting program for you. And I want to remind everyone that the God once said that painting is easy when you don't know how, but it's even more difficult when you do know how. And the last part of art, because we not only share artists like yourselves who talk with this medium, but also the written word, photographs, and other things. And I think it's important, even more so in these times, that something to remember about art is that it sends light into the darkness of men's hearts. Such is the duty of an artist, to bring that light. So thank you for bringing the light to us this evening, and for all the people who have the opportunity to share the joy of your work. So thank you all this evening, and we look forward to seeing you next month for another First Friday event. Good night and stay well, everyone.